Bona tarda, benvinguts a la seu de Barcelona del Col·legi d'Arquitectes. Avui, en aquest acte sobre el lideratge de les ciutats en una economia global. Només donar-vos la benvinguda i agrair a les persones i les institucions que han fet possible aquesta trobada avui aquí. Agrair a Vicente Guallart, arquitecte en cap de l'Ajuntament de Barcelona, Mr. Ricky Burdett, professor d'Estudis Urbans de la London School of Economics and Political Science i director de la London School of Economics de Londres, a la senyora Maria Reig, presidenta de Reig Capital Group i fundadora de Barcelona Global, Joaquim Coello, president d'A+ i membre de la Comissió Executiva de Barcelona Global, i Oriol Molas, analista polític i social. Agrair la seva presència, la possibilitat que Ricky Burdett ens proporciona de conèixer i compartir la seva visió i la seva experiència a partir de les transformacions originades per les Olimpiades de Londres i Hàbitat Urbà de l'Ajuntament de Barcelona i Barcelona Global per haver volgut organitzar i compartir aquest acte amb tots nosaltres. Gràcies i a partir d'ara té la paraula i portarà l'acte Vicente Guallart, arquitecte en cap de l'Ajuntament de Barcelona.
Bona tarda. En primer lloc volia disculpar la presència del tinent alcalde Antoni Vives perquè avui hi ha comissió d'Hàbitat Urbà i per la configuració d'aquesta i que fa de president, la seva intenció, la veritat, era haver deixat la comissió abans, però la seva condició de president fa que sigui impossible que la pugui abandonar fins que no s'acabi. Per tant, potser arribarà al final de la sessió, potser no arribarà. I would like to say thank you to Mr. Ricky.
It's translated.
It's translated? Oh, great. Okay. Bueno, volia donar les gràcies efectivament al Col·legi d'Arquitectes per acollir aquest acte i a l'oportunitat que ens dona el professor Ricky Burdett d'organitzar aquest debat juntament amb dos expresidents de l'Associació Barcelona Global i amb l'Oriol Molas, que és un consultor diguem-ne estratègic per ciutats. La veritat és que el motiu, el professor Ricky Burdett és un gran amic de la ciutat de Barcelona, després ens ho explicarà, ha estat aquí en múltiples ocasions, i aquesta conferència la volíem centrar, la volíem enfocar en la relació o la influència que poden tenir les ciutats en una economia global. Hi ha tot un debat al voltant del fet que la majoria de la població mundial es concentri en ciutats, fa que les pròpies ciutats estiguin devenint d'alguna manera al centre del món, evidentment d'una manera distribuïda. El rol de les ciutats, que en moltes ocasions es veu com el tercer o el quart nivell de governança d'un territori, des d'un punt de vista pràctic i funcional, veritablement és el lloc on viu la gent, en el qual mor la gent, en el qual es produeix l'economia, en el qual es produeix el CO2, diguem-ne. I des d'aquest punt de vista hi ha algunes ciutats en el món que exerceixen un cert lideratge en la transformació d'altres ciutats. Barcelona ho fa clarament, com avui ens explicarà el professor Ricky Burdett, i Londres també ho fa. I el que a nosaltres ens agradaria discutir, i per això hem creat aquesta taula també amb importants representants del sector financer o econòmic de la ciutat de Barcelona, seria veure com es pot traduir tota aquesta influència en activitat econòmica tant aquí a dintre de la ciutat com a fora de la ciutat. El que diria és que penseu que la diferència entre Londres i Barcelona, que són moltes, religioses, culturals, econòmiques, històriques, etc., però des d'un punt de vista de la formació fins i tot dels arquitectes és molt diferent, perquè podem pensar que en el cas de Barcelona el món de l'arquitectura i el món de l'urbanisme s'estudien, hi ha tot un coneixement molt profund al voltant de l'escola d'arquitectura i de les escoles d'arquitectura que han sortit al voltant. Però el cas de Londres és molt diferent, perquè en el cas de Londres existeix un món que es concentra al voltant del disseny, en el qual l'Architectural Association probablement és una de les escoles d'arquitectura més influents del món, però en el qual aquest mateix lloc, que té una gran influència en el món del disseny, el món de la transformació urbana, diguem-ne, clarament no són uns líders. Per què? Perquè tot aquest món de l'estudi urbà, de la transformació urbana, es produeix a la London School of Economics, que és una escola d'economia. Per tant, jo diria que fins i tot el propi plantejament de com es produeix la formació i en quin entorn es produeix ja prepara per una de les tesis, diguem-ne, de les qüestions que avui plantejaríem és com veritablement Londres i el món anglosaxó sap capitalitzar la seva influència, diguem-ne, en la manera de fer ciutats i en la manera de fer negocis dintre de la ciutat a través de les seves empreses, i com en el cas de Barcelona això, diguem-ne, no ho sabem fer tan bé i és una cosa que clarament tenim que aprendre. El professor Ricky Burdett, com s'ha dit abans, és arquitecte, professor en una escola de la London School of Economics, és director del programa LSE Cities i Urbanage Program, que han tingut una trajectòria molt important d'organització d'events, de discussió de ciutats en els últims anys en diversos llocs del món, i de fet dintre d'uns dies tindran una reunió a Rio. Ell, de fet, la seva recerca s'ha enfocat en les interaccions entre el món físic i social en la ciutat contemporani. És de destacar que ha estat el Chief Advisor per a urbanisme dels Jocs Olímpics London 2012 i ha estat advisor també de l'alcalde de Londres de l'any 2001 al 2006. Col·labora en moltes ciutats, va ser també de fet comissari de la Bienal de Venècia en l'any d'arquitectura, en l'any 2006 o 2007, 2006, i per tant, insisteixo, aquesta dualitat entre un arquitecte que treballa dintre d'una organització en una escola d'economia que té una gran influència mundial, jo crec que és un model del qual volem aprendre. Per això hem muntat aquesta discussió. Per tant, té la paraula el professor Ricky Burdett. Sí, gràcies.
Mr. President and Vicente, thank you very much for this introduction. And maybe we could have the lights down a little bit so that we can see the slides better. So, much as I feel very much at home in this wonderful city, I'm afraid I have to speak English because Catalan is not there yet. I could speak in Italian, but I think that might reduce the communications even further. So, I'm going to talk very much, as Vicente said, around some of the work that we've been doing for a number of years now at the London School of Economics, and also conclude by describing what has been happening in London and how London, in many respects, as a number of people here know, has been very influenced by this city. And it's fantastic to see David Mackey and Beth Gali here, who are in person very much part of that dialogue and influence, which now goes back at least 15 years, if not more. But I think to respond also to the challenges of this debate, which is talking about money and business and making cities competitive, it's important to stand back and not just talk about cities as single entities, as however beautiful, however wonderful, however important we think we are in London, and however important you think you are in Barcelona. There's a big world out there, which Vicente has already referred to. So I want to talk about some of the work that we've done literally globally to, in a way, set the stage of some of these bigger discussions about the economic, social, and I don't think we can sit here in a responsible way without also talking about the environmental dimension of cities. So I'm going to touch on all these aspects, and then I promise you, if we have time, we will talk about the Olympics in London as a recent event which I think has changed the way Londoners and politicians and investors in London have begun to think about their own city. And I think that's one of the great powers of these events, but also the dynamics and the relationships between the different constituencies. Vicente, when he was talking a moment ago and introducing me, that he was talking about London as a place of design and great places, schools which teach architecture, I certainly didn't think he was talking about the London School of Economics. And that would be wrong. There are 5 or 6 schools like the Architectural Association, the Bartlett School of Architecture. There are many, many wonderful places which have been incredibly rich and continue to be rich. What we've done, and I think you touched upon this, is in setting up a tiny department with 20, 25 people in a school of 10,000, is to investigate this one question, which is what is the relationship between space and society? That's what interests us. And where does design come into it? A lot. Where does politics come into it? A lot. And where does investment and social issues come into it? And we've been doing this, as you see from this map, by a series of annual investigations, which is what we call the Urban Age project. When we started our smaller, more modest teaching initiative, we had a number of incredibly distinguished teachers who were part of that. Richard Rogers, Charles Correa, and David Mackey. And if you remember David, that was now a few years back, but we don't need to get romantic and nostalgic about that. Since then, this project in a way has grown, but it's grown because to understand what's happening in London or Barcelona and to know what to do and to transfer skills, which I think is one of the key issues here and messages, we need to understand what's happening in the rest of the urban world. And we do this, as has already been alluded to, by a series of conferences. The next one will be in Rio. This was in London last year with Boris Johnson, the guy with the crazy hair, being looked at by the Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, with some amusement, because basically the mayor is going to challenge the Prime Minister very soon to take his place because the Olympics went so well. So these are things that I think one has to understand. And very soon we will be doing that in Rio de Janeiro with, in fact, Tony Vives and other friends from this city. So what are the issues? Going straight back to the question about space and society and politics, cities are, we sometimes talk about them as if they're all the same thing, cities. The world is urbanized and all that. But we have choices. We have enormous choices in terms of what we actually do. We can either do this, a city of 22 million people, and if this projector allowed it, it would cover the whole of this wall, 22 million people, 4 hours commuting time, right? More cars per person than in London or New York, in a city where the average income is about 10 times less, right? It's the only way to get around Mexico City. The impact on the environment is disastrous, and the impact on society is problematic, and we'll talk about that. But I'm just starting by saying, there are different ways of doing things, because here's another way of doing something, and someone decided, it didn't happen by chance, which is Hong Kong. I'll come back to describing this city. Now, I can already see a number of you saying, ugh, but this is the most efficient city in the world, whether we like it or not. It has commuting times not of 4 hours in Mexico City, but 11 minutes. 11 minutes on average, and I'll show you why later on. Now, there is a question as to whether we would want to live in this sort of environment. But in terms of efficiency, in terms of the economic issue, this is what, in a way, the market requires. And it requires a very different form of governance than other systems. Or you do this, which is a sort of happy middle compromise of royalty and business, organic design, and some sort of investment by politicians over time. But it is fascinating that London has never had a physical plan. Christopher Wren, the great architect from the 17th, 18th century, tried, when London then was burnt down, effectively. But you can't find a drawing which is what does London look like Haussmann or Cerdà did here. And that's, again, an interesting issue, because I think we may come back to this in the discussion. It gives this city, and perhaps even Barcelona, a certain resilience to respond to changes in the market, as we've seen in the last 10 years. 2008, every city crashed. London uniquely has picked up far ahead of the game than other cities, certainly in Europe and certainly in the UK. Now, global investment, Arab money, Russian money helps a lot in terms of that. But you also have to have the resilience, as I called it, and that is a spatial issue, to accommodate that change. And this is where I will end by saying that the Olympics, in many ways, had tried to really do that, and I'll come back to that at the very end. Now, this is familiar to nearly everyone in this room, whether you're born in Europe or whatever generation you are. I just want to, in a way, point out one important factor, that we happen to be here in terms of timing. You know, we're roughly here. The world's population is 54% urban. When my son will be my age, the world will be something like 75% urbanized. More dramatically is looking back. When my grandfather was alive, so it's not that long ago, the world was only 10% urbanized. So the issue here is not just scale of cities, which we'll talk about, but the pace of change is absolutely dramatic. And how do you deal with that is absolutely an economic question, because it requires far more investment into infrastructure, much more quickly into housing and hospitals and everything else than we've ever had to do before. Now, it's very good to be in Europe and talk about these things, but really this is not where it's happening. However central we think we are, and probably this does come to the discussion later, what this map shows is where growth has happened. In the darker green is where growth happened more or less since the Second World War. Okay, so mainly United States, interestingly Tokyo in the middle. In the light green, in the last 20 years or so, so interestingly, a lot of South America grew dramatically. And in white, if you can see it from the back of the room, it's pretty clear where it is. It's Asia, it's India, and very significantly Africa. Some of these are high protein economies, so to speak. Most of these are low energy countries at the moment. So the decisions of which way to go, the Hong Kong model or the Mexico City model, to make it very, very simple, or where Barcelona and London start selling stories about the way that cities should be designed, managed, and organized, is, I think, essential to this discussion. Now, I mentioned the size. We're talking about cities which are, yes, 20 million. Tokyo is still the biggest at 36 million. Lagos, not even the governor knows how many there are, but he thinks it's something like 16, 17 million. Mumbai, I think there are a number of colleagues and friends from India here. It changes dramatically by 2 or 3 million from the morning till the evening of the day. It changes completely at different times of the day, as does Barcelona, as does London. Now, every minute and a half that I'm speaking to you, there's a new person who's moved into Lagos, Kinshasa, Dhaka, or Mumbai. Every minute and a half. So in Lagos, you have 300,000 people a year. So it will become Barcelona in 7 or 8 years. An extra Barcelona is grown into that city, but without any planning, without any infrastructure. So again, this is where, in a way, what lessons do we present to these cities of the world that are growing becomes incredibly interesting and incredibly challenging. Now, cities are, of course, this has been said before, we wouldn't be here today with Global inviting us in a way to discuss these issues with architects if we didn't know that cities are where people come to do business. That's what they've always been about, and they will continue to do face-to-face contact. And something like 70-75% of global economy, of the output of the global economy, comes from cities. That's clear. Now, obviously, that means that they need to use energy. You need to get in your car and go there if you have to use a car, or your tram, or your bus, or your underground. You need to have air conditioning in buildings or heating if you need that. You need to turn lights on, etc., etc. So by far, the largest amount of global energy is consumed by cities. That's obvious. But in terms of the challenges for us from now forward, I think this is the most important thing. Maybe you can't read it at the back. But because of the previous slide, 3/4 of the world's CO2 emissions come from cities. It makes sense. It's not a mystery, right? So the question becomes, how do you design a city so that maybe you don't use so much energy and reduce CO2 emissions? Therefore, the decisions we take at the municipal level, right, this is, I think, a key point for us today in the discussion, actually have an effect on the planet, more so than nation states. And I think that gives strength to one of the great ideas that, of course, Pasquale Maragall was the first to talk about, Europe as cities. Here it is. I mean, if we don't realize that cities are actually doing this sort of damage, nothing will actually happen. So that's one axis, or the three axes I've talked about. The economy, that one. The second is the environment. And the third is basically the social dimension. Now, in Europe, we're in the comfortable situation, despite the enormous inequalities that we have in our own cities, and Barcelona included, not to have this situation here. Where you saw the white bits in that map in Asia and in Africa, the United Nations is basically saying that across the world, not just there, but across the world, one in every three of you sitting here, will live in a slum without basic access to water, infrastructure, or anything else. So again, this issue of time, this issue of infrastructure becomes fundamental. And this, I think, is a social time bomb in terms of what will actually happen. Now, I think that the social policies, the urban policies of what is done here, what is done certainly has been tried in London for the last 100 years, in terms of integrating different groups and providing affordable housing where possible, even though governments changed all those policies, is a fundamental lesson to actually pass on. And I was fascinated to hear that there's a project now between New York City and Barcelona looking at public housing in New York and in London. Now, if I were a New York architect, I'd say, what's public housing? There are two generations who have never been asked to design public housing or social housing in the United States because of what's been happening there politically. So these are interesting issues, and much of this is left to the market, so how do you deal with it? And here we come to a reality that, again, many of you know. It doesn't take a lot. I happened to take this picture in Shanghai a few years ago, but it really doesn't take much to take your camera around the growing cities of the world and see this. Now, the reasons, again, are absolutely clear. If you happen to be a Chinese citizen and you've lived for the first 20, 30 years of your life in a tiny place and you freeze in the winter, you have no running water, or you're overheated in the summer, which is what happens in Shanghai, the minute you start earning, because you're part of the great sort of acceleration of the Chinese economy, you want a space which has three fundamental things. You want a house, a room, an abode which has three fundamental things. One, space, literally space, which you've never had before. Second, you want running water. And third, you want electricity. So all these boxes have exactly those three things. We can't criticize this as a sort of response. What we can criticize, those of us who are interested in making cities, is that this will never be a city. It will be a neighborhood, a residential ghetto for people who live here, but it will not have those qualities, and it's not just the Barcelona street qualities or the London, East London qualities that we might get romantic about. It will just not have even the qualities that Shanghai has in its city center. So in the rush to, in a way, to resolve these issues, we are creating environments that I think will become dysfunctional in the next 20, 30 years. And we've sort of been there before. Now, many of you may have seen this picture, particularly if you saw the Venice Biennale, which I curated in 2006. But still, most people who see this picture think it's Photoshop. Right? Think it's, it's not real, is it? That you have a place like this in Paraisópolis, in one of the favelas of Rio, which has been there for 40 years, where none of these houses have running water. simply because it's an illegal settlement. And Brazil, being the world's 7th economy, rightly has people building apartment blocks where they're wealthy enough to have a swimming pool on each terrace. So there you have sort of difference cast in stone. This is not just a social problem, it's an economic problem. And it's certainly a cultural and political one. And it's actually the notion of this wall, rather than just the water and the no water, which I think is the most important thing that a designer or even a politician can deal with. So I'm thinking of lessons that we can pass on. What is extraordinary about London and Barcelona is actually the relative seamlessness, interconnectivity of areas of wealth and areas of not so much wealth, really quite close to each other. Of course there are extremes, but nothing like this, and nothing by design, and I think that's the issue that is important. So let me summarize these points before going into some case studies with this graph, and because I'm from the LSE, I have to show some graphs in order to gain credibility, particularly amongst the economists here. It's an interesting graph because it basically takes two of the issues that I've dealt with and put them together. Across the bottom of this graph is what the UN calls the Human Development Index. So the more you are on the right, the better educated, the more wealth, and the better health, more or less. The vertical axis is instead the environmental ecological footprint, broadly how much energy you use per person, okay, broadly speaking. So, you know, I'm an American citizen, so I can be rude about this country, and I'm going to be in a second. What is very interesting here is that Europe, therefore all of us, provide a sort of model where, of course, our quality of life, our economy is actually pretty strong, all in all, despite the recent blips. But our energy consumption per capita is actually relatively modest compared to what's happening up here. Now, this becomes even more dramatic when you look at it this way. This is the energy levels, effectively, that one Earth allows us to live in. So, the Americans are living in 5 times. We would need 5 Earths to support American lifestyles of living. So going way back to the question of the decisions that we need to make is where are we going to go in the future in terms of creating sustainable cities? And I think certainly European cities, whether it's Copenhagen, London, or Barcelona, a dense city, compact city, well serviced by public transport, is the way to go. And the real question is, for all those cities and countries in white, where are we going? You know, the South Africas, the Asias, the India, and everywhere else. So let's take India. Let's take Mumbai. Today, a city of something like 16 million people, where 60% of this city live in slums. Well known, incredibly resilient places, very active, very much part of the economy. It's not that it's the other side of the economy. It is the resilient part of the economy. This city is growing now, has grown at 2,000% since the beginning of the last century. London, by comparison, has grown 16% over that period of time. We grew a lot, of course, the century before, as Barcelona did. It's a different time period. Now, what in many ways brings this problem home for all of us is the thought that if the same proportion of people living in Mumbai today in slums continues, when by 2050 this city will become the largest in the world, there will be the whole of the population of London, New York, and Paris put together living in a slum. Right? Unless something is done about it. So again, these are interesting issues which are not just political or design ones, but also to do with what the private sector does about this. What do companies do in Asia, in these tiger economies, about making sure that this doesn't happen? Unfortunately, up until now, most of the companies operating in these sort of environments basically say, I'm not touching this. I'm going to go and build a new city in Pune or elsewhere, because it's impossible to actually make this place work in terms of efficiency. So Paulo, in Brazil, of course, the economic engine, in many ways much more similar to Barcelona with respect to Madrid, is also fascinating from many points of view, because this is what downtown looks like, a bit like New York in the 1920s. And this is what the edges of the city look like. Now, from where you're sitting, this looks actually quite charming. You know, you've got some nice things next to a lake. Looks like Como in northern Italy. But these are favelas with no running water, no toilets. This is the water reservoir of Sao Paulo. I don't need to tell you what's happened to the quality of the water. So, again, space, politics, society has a massive impact on a whole series of issues which are sometimes not thought about. And because the car lobby is incredibly powerful in Sao Paulo, because there are so many factories and so many jobs depend on it, again, a very strong factor in the local economy, 1,000 new cars are found on the streets of the city every day. Therefore, those who can afford it use a helicopter. There are 1,000 helicopters in this city, the same as New York, the same as Tokyo, and the income per capita here is much less. But if it takes 4 hours a day and you need to afford it, that's what you do to do a business deal. Now, in many ways, we can all offer other ways of doing that. When I tell people in Rio or Sao Paulo that actually in the city of London, the financial hub of London, 98% of the population who works there takes public transport, 98%. And the average income in the city is 600,000, so 700,000 euros. It means that people who are taking buses and the underground system are not just millionaires, they're billionaires. And this is just completely beyond comprehension in some of these developing countries, with one or two very interesting exceptions. So instead of just being negative, a number of us know well the several mayors from Bogota, Enrique Peñalosa amongst them. And here's a city which has exactly the same problems of some of the other ones I've described in South America. What model do they choose? Well, interestingly here, the decision was taken to introduce this, the metro bus with dedicated lanes. This is radical stuff in a country, in a city where you get shot if you sort of take jobs away from the illegal drivers of buses. And then I was struck by this picture because it shows what has been happening there for years, where they've built cycleways, not in the middle of the city, but out anywhere, out to the edges. Why? Because the mayors knew that they couldn't control informal growth in the city. It's just not possible. We can, but not there. You can't. So by building the cycleways like this, first of all, you could dig a hole in the ground and put sewers and electricity and other things. And then as the informal city comes, and this is actually, believe it or not, informal, even though it's very regular, you actually have a much more integrated system. And this guy takes his kids to school like this, instead of spending about 2.5 hours in a car or in a bus, as it was before. Now, don't just think of this in environmental terms or in terms of the profitability and productivity in the labor force. Think of it in terms of the relationship between these three individuals. It is fundamental. These guys talk to each other. In Bangkok, still today, kids get in the car at 5:30 in the morning in their pajamas, sleep for 2.5 hours to get to school, have breakfast in the car, and then eat in the car on the way back and fall asleep. I just think of the psychological dynamic and I would say damage that actually that does. So again, in talking about cities at this mega scale, I think we're very interested in trying to understand what the relationships are. You know, and this works just as well in trendy, super cool Copenhagen or Barcelona or London as it does in other parts of the world. So the question for us, maybe even later, is which model do you sell? What do you how can you say that actually what you do here applies to Rio and Sao Paulo? And I think that is not an easy debate, but a significant one. Now, some of the work we've been doing recently at the LSE is trying to also integrate these bigger issues I've been describing in terms of which are the leading cities that are doing things. And some of them are the obvious ones, the Copenhagens and the Stockholms. London is also quite good in terms of the environmental debate. And of course, we have studied Barcelona, so don't attack me now if I'm not showing it. But something very interesting has happened in these cities because of the politics and the realization that if they don't do something about the environmental issue, people are going to just leave the city and jobs are going to follow. And what has actually happened in these particular cities is what is known as decoupling, so separation between two things. Between the fact that actually people have got wealthier over the years, except for the little blip, obviously with the recession of 2007 over there. But broadly speaking, people in all these cities in Europe have got wealthier. But actually, and this is the most important thing, is that there's been a drop in energy use per person. Now, this is what we need to sell as a story. In other words, you can improve your quality of life, what the UN would call the Human Development Index, do better business, keep on doing well, compete and everything else, without necessarily the same graph going, the green graph going upwards. So I think that becomes an important issue which has spatial and sort of political dimensions behind it. Now, this comes down to issues of how do you hardwire the system. That's why I think the Barcelona Protocol, some of the issues that you're very involved in sort of upgrading both the IT system, but also the basic things. This is in Copenhagen showing the district heating, which covers 98% of the city. Incredibly efficient system. Now, in the new cities of Asia, China, or Africa, where they need cooling or heating systems, is this a model that needs to be described? Now that becomes rather technical, but I think very, very important part of the story in terms of making cities more efficient. Here I want to move back to, I guess, in many ways, one of the things that really does link London to Barcelona, and it's to do with urban form and the big discussion around the concept of density. Now I think we've learned from you that suburban two-story houses on the edges of the city may be pretty, but ain't the best way to make a city feel like a city. This is what central London more or less feels like. This is New York, which I think you know very well, and we've already seen an image of Hong Kong. Now, what we've done at the LSE, and this is relatively new work, which I know some of you have seen because we presented in Barcelona last Christmas at the Smart City event, is comparing residential density with where people work. And I think this is fundamental to the discussion about the strength of the economy and what we can do to make cities more competitive. And this is both a sort of planning issue, but it's also a real estate issue. What this is on the left, I hope you can see it, is that where people live. Okay? The height of the little stick is not the height of the building, but the density per square meter. Okay? So this is suburbia, two-story cottages on the edge. These are 6, 7-story buildings quite close together, as I showed you before. On the right is where people come to work on a daily basis. So that's the City of London, Canary Wharf. Now, it's a pretty amazing difference between the two, right? But we have a massive public transport system which has cost hundreds of millions of pounds over the last 100 years, effectively. London Underground celebrated its 100th anniversary this year. And what is interesting is that, where you have that difference, you need to manage it. Now, New York, a city of the same population of London, is much denser, as we know. So the difference between, that's mainly downtown and midtown, is much closer. But, and here's why I showed you the Hong Kong picture before, that's residential and that's work. It's practically the same. So it's no wonder that this is one of the most efficient systems in the world, both in terms of the underground and public transport system. But just look at these numbers over here, which are really quite extraordinary. Maybe you can see it from the back. 93% of the population of Hong Kong, 93% takes public transport of whatever form to go to work. In Tokyo, it's around 80%. And in some of the other cities, however good they are, like London, it's something maybe like 60%. And that accounts for this critical issue that it takes only 11 minutes average commuting time in this city. That's a place that people want to go to do business. So That's an issue that I think we need to take into account. And someone like Edward Glaser, the great economist from Harvard, has written many reports, and this book published a couple of years ago, which basically argues that density is good for a good, strong economy. Very clear relation, but density meant in architectural form, that there's a clear correlation in the studies that he's done. I'm not an expert on this, as he is as an economist, which I think really make a very, very strong case for understanding what that means. Now, we've looked also at a number of case studies in Europe to understand how cities can actually react to shocks in the system. And I'm going to show you just two cities, Torino and your own city. Now, both cities, in the last but one recession, some of you will remember that there was a recession in the 90s, there's been a more recent one in 2007, 2008, for different reasons, these cities had to come back. In the case of Torino, which is the manufacturing capital of cars in Italy, Fiat, 120,000 people were fired because Fiat started closing down because of competition from abroad. As a result of that, they started investing heavily in a whole series of things that we don't have time to really go into. What's most important is this, that as a result of these investments, as a result of the combination actually and very close relationship that many of you, in fact, in the front row were much part of the story, what happened is that actually the economy picked up pretty dramatically rather than stay down on the ground. And always the economy and the employment pattern and income per capita in Barcelona after this sort of critical moment performed much better than the nation state. Sorry, this is Turin and this is Barcelona here. So same sort of story. And I think perhaps one of the things we can discuss is how does an organization like Global actually help this to happen. It can't all be in the hands of the state, and it can't also only require sort of public infrastructure. Now, I was asked to also refer to this issue of global cities, as if global cities are only over there. They're in India, they're in Africa. No, global cities are here. It's enough to walk around the Gótico and see the faces of people who, not only tourists, but people who actually live here. Yours is as an international city, not as much as London, which is a bit more international. At the moment we have something like 45% of our population was born outside London, which is really quite extraordinary, which is outside the UK, frankly. And you have areas like this that, you know, are as global as anything else. In fact, this is in South London. Probably no one has ever been there. It's called Peckham. This is where actually people come from over there. Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. During the recession in the last years, this part of London, this street, kept on going up and up, went a little bit flat, and is now picked up. It never dropped because of the resilience, actually, of what was happening in the environment here. And what we've been doing is actually studying the morphology of this environment. And you can probably see, and I don't have time, you see how deep the shops are. They're long, thin structures, right? Very deep. When you go into the street, on the front of any of these, you do your nails or your hair. But that's about 2 meters. Then the next 2 meters, you buy chickens. The next 2 meters, you buy avocados. And at the end, there's Western Union, where you change money or send it back. So there's a whole microeconomy within this. Now, what do we do as planners, and what does industry or investment do to plan for this? Nothing. It just happens. So I think that's something extremely interesting for us to sort of take into account, which is, how does one take advantage of this global thing? Well, certainly not by kicking people out and putting it higher barriers for migration, because that will kill absolutely everything. I'm a strong proponent, as the Mayor of London, is in opening the doors rather than actually closing them down, because otherwise economies of cities die. Now, before I begin to come to London and talk about, sort of in a way, the final part of what I want to say to you, is the importance of the politics of the city. Nothing that we're talking about, of course, if Tony were here, he would immediately get nervous and excited at the same time, wouldn't he? About, what is the potential. Now, you can't see this well from the back of the room, but I just want to make a very, very simple point. Some cities, such as London, if you can see from the back, the dark bit is where the buildings are, right, where people sort of live. The very thin green line is where the mayor has responsibility. Many years ago, in fact in the 1870s, 80s, London created something called the London County Council, probably the first form of urban management, urban governance, and that's evolved in many different ways. Interestingly, all the land around it, which is unbuilt, because it has the green belt around it, is other jurisdiction. But everything to do with transport, with housing now, with the environment, and inward investment, by the way, is the responsibility of effectively one jurisdiction. Now, let's take the largest city in the world, Mexico City. Now, we all think of Mexico City as this big lump. You can probably not see it. But actually, the mayor of Mexico City is responsible for 7 of the 22 million people. Most of the city is in another state, in another sort of neighboring state. This has always been left, and this has always been right. The president of the country, of Mexico City, Peña Nieto, was the governor of this other area for about 20 years. The guys never talked to each other on the whole. Never. So the water systems, the housing policy, the transport policy were never aligned. So alignment, I think, is just as important as political desires. And it's fascinating if you compare, let's say, how New York is run with now Bloomberg is about to stop. You have city government, and this is the mayor. You have a very weak system of local government, only 5 boroughs, only 5. You have very strong involvement from the state of New York and federal involvement. And if you simplify enormously the London organization, we have a very heavy local democracy. The mayor now is in charge of some of these things, and no yellow. We don't have Catalonia, so to speak. So it's just an interesting way. But this is a very idealized system, and this is where I want to move into London. This is actually how London works. You can't see it. You can't work it out. It doesn't make any difference. It's a complete chaos in terms of little circles. The mayor is over there in the middle. But the reality is, and by the way, London First or the equivalent of your organizations are somewhere in there and very, very significant. But nonetheless, this city, and this is where I want to begin to conclude, has tried to deal with some of the bigger issues that I've talked about social sustainability, about the environment, about business, in something which is called the London Plan. I said before, we don't have a physical plan. There's no beautiful drawings that you can see of what, the equivalent of Sagrera might be, or the equivalent of the logistic park in El Prat. We don't have that sort of stuff. We don't do that. It's not part of our tradition. But we've been able to do this. In fact, strongly influenced by Maragall, when Richard Rogers, the architect, was responsible for this and advising Ken Livingstone. And basically it says 2 or 3 very simple things. London must never grow outside this black line because otherwise you get sprawl. Full stop. Not negotiable. That's pretty powerful. So all this is countryside, still today. Where there are large brownfield areas, like La Sagrera, ex-industrial areas, make them special zones, the stars, opportunity areas, where if there's good public transport, but only if there is good public transport, you allow much greater mix of uses, greater densities, but design then becomes very important in how you manage that. So in many ways, that's the story of London. That's the plan. And since most of the stars are in the east and in this sort of area, because that historically is the poorest part of London, when you win the Olympics, just like you did here, well, you might as well spend it here and not in rich West London. And that was one of the key things which I'm going to come back to. So these are the exportable ideas, I think, to any of the cities globally that need to be sort of talked to about what the issues are. This is a simple diagram, but it's a series of rather rich and sort of complicated ideas that I think you understand well in this city here. Now, this has allowed this sort of political system a number of decisions to be taken. In Barcelona, it's obvious. Elsewhere in the world, it's not. great Mayor Bloomberg, and I say great as in cash, has been unable to have a congestion charge agreed. Can you believe it? You know, one of the richest men in the States changed the Constitution to elect himself the 3 times in a row. That's impressive. Tony Vives should think of that next. But I mean, he was unable to do that. Why? Because the state of New York is actually in charge of transport. And they said, why should we do that? It doesn't matter. It's like Catalonia saying, you can't have congestion charge in Barcelona. In London, we don't have to ask anyone, so this is why it happened. And that's why this has happened, it's been quite successful. And probably most importantly, and this is a fantastic victory of London First, of your equivalent organization here, Barcelona Global, is lobbying like hell to now put around 11 billion pounds, 15 billion euros of public money, plus quite a lot of private money going into, in creating a high-speed line under London, which will take you roughly from Heathrow Airport to the center and all the way to Canary Wharf in less than 30 minutes. So any of you who've tried doing that journey will know. So this is like the Paris RER system, and it's only happened because of the political lobbying. But behind this was the plan that I showed you before, this idea that East London needs to have investment, and there's greater density, and basically the private sector gets all its money back by getting on each station higher development rights and therefore economic value return. Now, if you manage it well and design it well, you can get a good piece of city. If you don't, you mess it up. This is one wonderful example, building by Renzo Piano, a close friend of many people here. We can either love or hate this building, it doesn't matter, it's the Shard. It's built and it cost £2 billion with money from the Qatari royal family. The most interesting thing about this building is that it will have something like 10,000 people working in it. There are 47 car parking spaces and only for disabled people. So that was the planning thing. Now, when I talk about this here, yeah, it's impressive, but sure, we understand that. When I talk about this in Sao Paulo, they think I'm on some sort of drug, and that this is completely impossible, that you can intervene in the market in this way. The missing link is that actually the market wants this certainty, and this works perfectly well because underneath here is one of the largest underground stations and railway stations, the whole of the UK, not just London. So this story of integrating transport with business, with sustainability and everything else is really something that I think we are in a position to talk about. Now, Vicente, 5 minutes more to talk about the Olympics and then I'll stop. When we won in 2005, which was 2 days, by the way, after the underground bombing, there were these 2 amazing emotions of being a Londoner, you know. People you know, or people who, on literally the same route I take every day from my house to the LSE is where the bus was bombed. I happened to be in Shanghai organizing the Urban Age event. But you know, these things are very close. There are people, as I say, not only do you know, but the whole city reacts to these things in a very dramatic way. 2 days after we were awarded the London Games for 2012. By the way, Paris, which has been trying for some time, was going to win, but apparently the real story in our case, I'm not sure whether it's true, but it sounds good, is that the Greek representative pressed the wrong button, and the Scandinavian representative was so upset with Jacques Chirac, because he'd gone to Helsinki and been rude about their food, that they voted for the Brits. So that's a fascinating story of why we won the Games. Now, when we won the Games, we wondered what to do. Now, a number of us were closely involved at the time, and David Mackey had been to the site well before we'd actually won the competition and done a wonderful scheme of what to do with this part of London. Why was there thinking about this part of London? This is the story over here. In dark green, you have the most deprived areas of London. Lowest levels of employment, so high unemployment, lots of women, teenage pregnancies, incredibly low levels of education, and in a moment I'll also show you very different health conditions from west to east London. As you can see, sort of the periphery of London is relatively well off. these eastern areas and southern areas are instead much more deprived. The darker the color, the more deprived it is. If you take the underground station at Westminster and you go to the Olympic site, which is basically here, on the Jubilee line, every tube stop, as a man, in this global city of the world, you lose 1 year's life expectancy. In this city, today. It's the same difference as Ho Chi Minh City and Hong Kong, and La Paz and Buenos Aires, in one city. So the fact that there are inequalities, and that you might actually want to address them, I think is again a key factor that those of us involved in suggesting to other countries and cities what to do needs to be described. Now, we didn't have to look very far to decide what to do. I'm just showing you our context is different, but what we wanted to do, which is restitch the city from here to here. I'm not going to talk about it in this room, particularly with the designers here, not to mention the residents, is such an extraordinarily simple success story that we just wanted to photocopy it. So we tried. This was the site in 2005 where the Olympics was, right in the middle of the most deprived areas. This is what happened just about before the Games. Just look at these temporary venues, which are hockey stadia here and this one. Just look at those blue ones and that white one. And this is a sort of artist impression of what's going to happen over the next 20 years or so. So that's where the blue hockey stadia were, and that's where the rather nice, I have to say, basketball arena was over here. It's part of the first phase of new development, which is actually going on site next month, which is going to look more like that. David, you'll be pleased to see that there are streets, there are front doors, and it's the London typology without making the Prince of Wales happy. So in that sense, I think we've won a long debate that we've tried to win over years. Around this area, it's London. It's mixed, east, funky, mixed London. It's exactly the economy that I described earlier through our studies. And when we went to see the site in 2005, it had the largest fridge mountain in Europe. So more crap from every part of the house went here. So the pollution under here was dramatic. Exactly in this spot, I'll show you later, is where the velodrome was built. Very simply, this is what we did for the... Tony, you've missed the punchline. Yeah, okay. But no, we made a story for you, but okay. So I did say that this London story of the Olympics is where I'm ending, was rather inspired by here. What we did, there's the site. There was only one street going through it. A bit like where your Olympic Village now is, what must have been before with all the industries. You couldn't get from A to B, from one side to the other. It must have been the same. There was only one. The result of the first 400 million pounds, 500 million euros say, of money went into making 38 new bridges, connections, and everything else, so that the surrounding communities here, and here would have access to it. So you don't end up creating the sort of ghetto, which I think is the great risk in these projects. We then did what we needed to do, which is build the things that we don't have in London. We don't have an aquatic center. We don't actually have a velodrome. We only needed a stadium, which then could be made smaller. And then, importantly, built an enormous number of temporary structures, which you see here. Now, in terms of the urban story, the key question, the key statement is this. Once you've got rid of these stars in red, what can you do? Well, you've cleaned the land, you've invested in the roads, the connections, you've made a wonderful park in the middle of it, and therefore you actually have the ideal development sites for offices, for housing, for employment, and for bringing into East London something which has not been there for literally 100 years, if not more. So in that sense, it is really bringing back sort of the story to the big ambitions of trying to create sort of social equity in a city. That's exactly what has happened. These have, as I speak to you now, the temporary structures have all been taken down, and what you see are big pieces of development, which are now the subject of major design competitions, private developers. Very importantly, The whole of the land here remains in public hands. Basically, the mayor remains the freeholder. I don't know whether that term connects, but all the developers who are investing in it get either 99-year leases, which will then be renewed over time. This is critical, and again, a story for us to tell to others, because it's the way the public sector doesn't stop the private sector from coming in at all, but guarantees the rules to make, as David taught me many years ago, the public space belongs to the public. That's so simple, so essential, and still shocks most people. You talk about these things. So once those white areas with the circles, with the ellipses are developed, this is what will actually happen. And if you half close your eyes, which actually from where you're sitting, I think, for those of you who London and know the typology of London, there's a park, there's a transport infrastructure hub over there. It looks like London. It sort of feels like London. It's messy, it's slightly organic, it's got housing, it's got little rivers, it's got sort of back and front. It feels like London. Now, as it happens here, I'll show you a major group, which is Barcelona-based, iCity, is creating 6,000 jobs here, 10,000 jobs there. Not all of it is housing, so I hope it will not be a dormitory town. You remember where I showed you the Fridge Mountain a few minutes ago, right? Exactly in that point is there, same point. That's where I think, actually the nicest building in the Olympics, the Velodrome, by Michael Hopkins and partners, was actually built. Look at that, I think it's a rather beautiful park. Now with 38 access points, literally everyone can go there, and as of the 27th of July, it is open to the public. What will happen next, and this is taken during the games, and see the Velodrome there, is that this area is being slowly converted and will, in 10 years' time, there's the Velodrome, okay? So let me do that again. Velodrome, so stand back a bit. The same sort of park will be where there's a frontage of housing, and behind that is where the iCity sort of employment center will be, which I think will make it feel very much like part of London. So, in many ways, this is a story about regeneration and resilience. And even this building, which looks ugly as hell at this moment, and even Zaha Hadid, not an easy thing for her to do, accepts that it was ugly as hell at the time, the swimming pool. That picture is actually not construction, but deconstruction. Because that wing and that wing, which were only there for the games, are literally being taken away. And today, they've replaced those horrible side wings with actually beautiful graves. This was the original design. So everything has been designed with a view of what happens in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, the legacy story. Now, as we know, and Tony will be there in 2 weeks with me, in Rio, wow, these are difficult conversations to have. They think this is sort of insane way of actually spending money. But surely it costs more. Yes, it does cost more. But think of the benefit for the families who are going to live here for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And that actually is the sort of where the equation really hits. So the pool will be accessible to everybody. Now, we talk about successes, we also make mistakes. This is what happened during the games, 200,000 people. In exactly the same spaces, this is what is being proposed. So an extension of the park in the sort of southern area. This, which was the Olympic Village, very interestingly, has been bought by the same people who bought the Shard, and 50% of it, so the Qatari royal family, and 50% of it is social housing. Now, whether we like these buildings or not, what is interesting that each of these blocks, which are perimeter blocks, literally the affordable housing and the private housing is in the same block. There is no difference. In that sense, again, a photocopy perhaps of the Cerda sort of basic plan. This has been pretty radical stuff to do in London. This is the media center, which now has been taken over by iCity and is being converted. And 10,000 jobs have been created in the shopping center. The word Westfield has become rather famous, unfortunately, recently because of events in Africa. But very interestingly, of the 10,000 jobs, 80% of them are part-time, and that means that many of the women, particularly Asian women who live in the area, now have a job for the 4 or 5 hours a day that they're not going to pick up their kids from school. A massive difference in terms of what's happening to this area. So let me conclude with really bringing together these strands of what I've been talking about. Are there models that we can present around the world which are to do with thinking of cities, planning them, how to bring in the private sector, but how to be strong when necessary in terms of the public role and public administration? What role does design actually play in making cities more inhabitable? And I would say that, in many ways, the London plan, inspired as it has been by you guys over here, is fundamental. I mean, so many things have been learnt and accumulated in terms of our knowledge in our city, both in terms of personalities, as I say, and re-stress who happen to be in the room, and in terms of just understanding the issues of density, access, quality of public space, the role of Oriol Molas in talking about small projects, not just big plans, was for us incredibly important and worked very well for the London sort of DNA, which hates anything the French do, So these things are really quite interesting. So, taking this and beginning to understand when I was here only a few weeks ago that you're extending, in a way, this approach by looking at the edges of the city as it sort of grows out is absolutely fascinating. And I think these are the stories really that we need to take back as models of effectively planning, thinking cities and making cities sort of work in these areas around the world, so that we can use our models as successful models to influence what's happening around the world and make cities more sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricky, for your incredible presentation. Tal com havíem parlat en la introducció, l'objectiu a partir d'aquesta conferència voldríem parlar sobre la idea del lideratge de les ciutats en una economia global. Com a partir de tot el coneixement que generem al voltant de les ciutats, de les experiències que tenim, de les nostres empreses, dels nostres professionals, podem generar economia a la ciutat i dels nostres ciutadans i de les nostres empreses en el món. Per això hem convidat a la Maria Reig, que l'hem presentat abans, que li volíem demanar en 5 minuts que ens pogués explicar o pogués fer un statement, una declaració al voltant de què creu ella que des de Barcelona podem fer per d'alguna manera transformar aquesta influència que hem vist i que des de Londres i des de molts llocs del món ens expliquen en economia per la pròpia ciutat.
M'ha agradat molt l'exposició que ha fet, però jo penso que Barcelona té un model molt consolidat i és una ciutat que s'ha sabut desenvolupar l'espai urbà conservant la seva autenticitat i sent una ciutat que no expulsa, sinó que inclou, cosa que no han lograt moltes ciutats del món. Però Barcelona, clar, no té els reptes que tenen aquestes ciutats que ens han presentat. Barcelona és una ciutat que no ha crescut tant i no té aquests importants reptes d'acollir milions de persones que arriben a la ciutat i que no saben ni tenen d'equipar-se. Jo penso que Barcelona és una ciutat que té un repte, en els pròxims 10 anys, té un repte molt important, que és apostar per la qualitat. Si les ciutats aposten per la qualitat, el creixement és molt més fàcil de resoldre els desajustos que creen apostar per la quantitat. Jo penso que la ciutat de Barcelona té una condició molt bona, que està molt diversificada. I abans de vindre estava parlant amb algú que em deia que les ciutats es tenien d'especialitzar. Jo crec que no, que les ciutats del futur tindran d'apostar per la diversificació i la diversitat, i que les ciutats del futur, que seran globals, que tindran influència global, són aquelles que hauran apostat per un costat per la qualitat i per l'organització de les seves xarxes internes. O sigui, jo penso que els actors ciutats ja no són l'Ajuntament ni els actors clàssics, sinó que són mils de petits actors que innoven constantment, i aquí hi ha la gran capacitat del major, o de l'economia de la ciutat, de captar totes aquestes idees, fer-les connectar, transversalitzar-les i que pugui fertilitzar una nova economia. Jo penso que si abans l'especialització era un factor de competitivitat, jo penso que avui és la diversificació i la transversalitat els que donaran valors a les ciutats. Però penso també que quan parlem de qualitat i d'organització, abans s'ha de crear una visió. O sigui, sense visió tu no pots actuar. I jo crec que les ciutats aquestes que ens ha ensenyat el conferenciant, que tenen aquests grans problemes, és que no han consolidat una visió, han anat creixent a mida que anaven entrant gent a la ciutat i anaven allargant els carrers, anaven ficant els equipaments com podien. I això, clar, això avui crea un repte molt gran, que jo crec que aquí sí que hi ha molt a fer, i Barcelona, jo crec que el model de Barcelona pot ajudar moltíssim a aquestes ciutats a refer el seu model, o sigui, a regenerar aquestes ciutats. Que jo quan veia de vegades, per exemple, la diapositiva que he passat de São Paulo, de les faveles i el building aquell amb les piscines, doncs jo no sé on viuria, igual viuria a la favela ja, perquè potser allà hi ha un altre interès, hi ha una altra manera de viure, hi ha una manera de connectar amb la gent, hi ha una humanitat que no hi és allà dalt. I jo penso que una ciutat, aquestes ciutats que tenen faveles, no ens tenim d'espantar, el que tenim de fer és agafar aquesta força creativa que tenen aquestes ètnies i tota aquesta gent que venen a la ciutat a triomfar i donar-los l'oportunitat de poder viure com volen, però ordenadament, i, per dir alguna cosa, aprofitant tota aquesta energia creativa i passant-la potser cap als que viuen als buildings aquests més alts. Jo, avui, no sé si ho dic tot de cop, però jo crec que a les ciutats, com per exemple ja parlem de Barcelona, ja tenim el regidor aquí, les ciutats com Barcelona tindrien de donar-se una visió molt potent. Aquesta visió no pot ser feta des del sector públic, ha de ser feta amb tots els sectors i amb ambició de projectar-se cap al futur. Aquest model el té de vendre i compactar i després fer-lo, exportar-lo a les altres ciutats del món. Ja té una base que el pot exportar, però aquesta nova Barcelona no serà igual que la que tenim. Jo penso que aquesta necessitat de crear aquest model de ciutat nou, que no és només arquitectònic, perquè les ciutats són contenedors d'inquietuds, d'economia, d'energia, de fertilització creuada, que jo en dic. Doncs aquest contenedor cal que tingui un guió, si no, difícilment podrem tindre influència.
Joaquim Coello, president de Plus i expresident de Barcelona Global.
Jo crec que a mi la conferència m'ha semblat magistral en tots els sentits, i molt entenedora, i ja centrant... Perdó. Jo crec que la conferència m'ha semblat magistral perquè ha centrat molt bé el problema. A veure, jo m'agradaria començar per dir una cosa. Jo crec que és evident que les ciutats en el futur tindran un paper cada vegada més important perquè a les ciutats l'economia és més eficient. encara que només fos per això, és evident que això passarà. És a dir, un dels problemes del subdesenvolupament d'Àfrica és que molta de la població africana viu en ambients rurals, no? En tant en quant amb 50 anys aquesta gent visqui en ciutats, podrà augmentar el nivell de vida, el nivell d'educació, el nivell de benestar de la població. Per tant, això em sembla que és bastant evident. Les sinergies, la massa crítica, la proximitat, la facilitat dels serveis a les ciutats, tot això fa que l'economia funcioni millor, per tant la gent pot viure millor i per tant és evident que les ciutats tindran en el món futur un paper creixent. Bé, però això porta immediatament a la segona qüestió, i la segona qüestió és que és un entorn complex, és un entorn dens i per tant que s'ha de planificar. És a dir, això funcionarà si hi ha planificació. Jo crec que el conferenciant ha fet una referència molt clara a això, no? Una planificació adequada que permeti que la ciutat tingui uns determinats usos, per exemple els Jocs Olímpics, i després es converteixi en una ciutat. Jo crec que amb això Barcelona és exemplar i Londres, per el que ha explicat també, em sembla fonamental. Per tant, és un pol de creixement, és un pol d'eficiència econòmica, però s'ha de planificar i s'ha d'organitzar. Com es pot fer això? Jo crec que és evident que hi ha d'haver una unió i una col·laboració entre el que és públic i el privat. Això em sembla que és bastant evident. Però és evident que el públic ha d'establir les regles del joc perquè el privat es pugui desenvolupar. I aquestes regles del joc han d'estar regulades. Jo crec que tots sabem les conseqüències que té en el món la desregulació. És a dir, l'activitat privada, el mercat, no hi ha res que ho pugui substituir. Jo crec que l'economia planificada ha demostrat el seu fracàs i és una qüestió que tothom accepta, però és veritat que han d'haver unes regles del joc i un marc regulatori, i això em sembla que a la ciutat ja ha de ser. Per exemple, s'ha parlat aquí d'una cosa que a mi em sembla que té atractiu, no? És a dir, el sòl de la ciutat és de l'Ajuntament o és de l'autoritat pública i això es pot llogar o fer leasings o concessions o el que sigui durant temps. Bé, i una última reflexió. A mi em sembla que el model Barcelona és obvi que és un èxit, jo crec que això no és una obvietat, és un lloc comú, no cal dir-ho, no? Però moltes vegades m'he preguntat per què ha passat això, no? Jo crec que lligat amb això hi ha a Barcelona una condició significativa que ha fet la ciutat més forta, i és que Barcelona, la ciutat l'ha fet la societat civil. No l'ha fet l'administració pública, no tenim ministeris, no tenim grans avingudes, no tenim desfilades. És a dir, el fet que Catalunya no ha tingut un estat durant molt temps i per tant que Barcelona ha sigut una ciutat desenvolupada per la ciutadania, per les organitzacions. Jo crec que els catalans, una de les nostres, i naturalment els barcelonins, una de les nostres fortaleses és la capacitat d'organitzar-nos i de fer coses en conjunt, és el que al final ha fet la ciutat. Si compareu Barcelona amb París o compareu naturalment Barcelona amb Madrid, es veu clarament, no? La influència de l'administració pública, la influència del govern, la influència dels poders públics o la influència de la ciutadania. I això em sembla que és un exemple i d'aquí se'n poden treure moltes conclusions com queda aquí. Gràcies.
Moltes gràcies. Oriol Molas, analista polític i urbà.
Primer, gràcies per la invitació. El següent que faré és una pregunta retòrica, és què faig aquí? Ja veieu que costa a vegades inclús presentar-me, i penso que soc fruit d'una intuïció que per sort en Ricky Burdett converteix en certesa, i és la necessitat de posar una perspectiva a vegades diferent a l'urbanisme i a l'arquitectura mateix, que és la visió sociològica. A part de la visió magistral de sociologia urbana, que jo li agraeixo, perquè en tot cas la seva fantàstica, m'ha semblat sobretot una lliçó de comercialització i venda per vosaltres. M'ha semblat que ha donat és un decàleg, un guió de com s'ha d'anar a vendre, perquè el que he fet és explicar el que tots n'heu sentit a parlar i s'ha fet servir molt un mot també comú, però que té en veritat més força del que sembla, que és el relat. Has explicat un relat. Un relat és, molt sovint quan anem a vendre no sabem prou bé com hem de vendre, i molt sovint ens quedem amb el que fem, o molt sovint amb el què, amb el com. I ell avui ha explicat el per què. I l'important és el per què. Un dia també una conversa amb Antoni Casamor sobre justament la internacionalització del sector i les dificultats de sortir fora i vendre el model Barcelona. I dèiem, tenim el model Barcelona però ens costa molt, la veritat és que no tenim prou èxit en vendre'l. I veiem, pel que ens ha ensenyat el Ricky que no és el nostre model que s'està imposant de moment. I comentàvem, i li vaig demanar o el vaig jo punxar perquè intentés explicar una miqueta què era això del model Barcelona. Doncs va ser perfectament capaç, en 5 minuts o 10 minuts, d'explicar-me 4 o 5 elements essencials que explicaven una miqueta el per què d'aquest model. I avui en Reig Burdett també està parlant molt del que hi ha al darrere de tot plegat, no? El per què fem urbanisme, el per què fem arquitectura. I és diguem-ho així, deixem-ho dir així, el client final, no? Que no deixa de ser la ciutadania o la gent, no? Parlem de les persones. Per tant, m'ha encantat, en tot cas, el plantejament que ha fet, i si l'enteneu bé, és un plantejament comercial. Jo trobo que ha fet un plantejament comercial, amb gràfics i a vegades parlant amb conceptes molt amplis, però en el fons és una cosa directa de com sortir i com explicar el per què té sentit la nostra feina o per què us haurien de comprar en qualsevol lloc del món la vostra tasca. Per tant, la primera cosa, això. Només 2 apunts, i només perquè la gent que em coneix sap que em podria passar 2 hores ara parlant de sociologia urbana, només per gust, per tant no ho faré, com a excepció, avui no ho faré, però sí volia només posar 2 o 3 dades que em sembla que ens sorprendran de nosaltres mateixos, que no ens coneixem millor des de fora. Perquè hem dit nosaltres, el Ricky Burdett sí que ho ha dit, ha dit una miqueta més Londres, però Barcelona és una ciutat molt diversa. El 40% ha nascut fora, el 20%, si voleu, la resta de l'estat espanyol, i un 20% a l'estranger, de la gent que viu ara a Barcelona en aquests moments. Això és Catalunya, no és Barcelona, 1,5 milions d'immigrants, molts ara en parlem també a la Unió Europea, en els últims 10 anys. Es parlen més de 160 llengües a la ciutat de Barcelona. Més de 160 llengües, per tant, només us passegeu pel Raval una miqueta i també us adonareu. L'altre dia, amb algú de l'Ajuntament, parlant d'ell, justament que li semblava que jo era com Londres, que una part del Raval justament sonava com Londres, i com Londres volia dir, suposo, aquest mestissatge, aquest melting pot en un lloc petit i això, però que dona molt de sí. Per tant, la primera cosa és que Barcelona, Déu-n'hi-do, la feinada que ha fet i que fa i que té, per justament fer que funcioni, perquè és un miracle, però funciona, que hi hagi 1,5 milions d'ànimes amb visions, interessos, reptes diferents sobre la vida i que la cosa no ens matem uns als altres. De tant en tant hi ha alguna cosa, però no ens matem uns als altres i resulta que la cosa funciona força bé. Per tant, res, sisplau, agafem nota del que acaba de dir en Ricky Burdett i anem a vendre.
Ricky, maybe you want to reply?
Well, I certainly have spoken enough, but I have to comment on. I've never been called a salesman, but to be a salesman of city ideas is actually wonderful. I think I will savor that. But I mean, in many ways, you're touching on an issue which I think is very important, which is about communication, about ideas that maybe so many constituencies understand, but very few are able to cut through them. I think it's interesting being in the Institute of Architects, with all respect to fellow architects, how sometimes these discussions are completely inward-looking in terms of what the issue, while the issues are, I think, very outward-looking. I think the language that is sometimes used is problematic, and that applies to many others. I was very touched and impressed by your comment about, here you are representing the business community, effectively. I don't think you mentioned the word business once. You said that the success of Barcelona is about the integration of civil society. I mean, that is incredibly radical way of thinking about how do you sell this model in many ways. It's not about inward investment and bringing company X and company Y, but it's about creating that sort of fertile base, which is all about the diversity and sort of social enrichment which comes from connection with others. I mean, a very close friend of Beth and mine is the sociologist Richard Sennett, who of course has written extensively about this need, that the great value of the city is that it brings people who don't know each other together, and the great luxury of being alone in a crowd. Now, Barcelona is the fantastic model of that. That, you can actually feel part of something, but without people bothering you, even if they're touching you, which is for an Englishman a great problem. And I thought your point about the need for vision is absolutely, correct. You've been lucky here through, what, 5, 6 mayors, from Narcís Serra on, right, more or less. You're lucky. There aren't that many cities around the world. You might disagree with some people, you might like some of them less, but you've been lucky in having this continuity of, first of all, belief in the city, which we've just heard of from sort of different constituencies, but a sort of shared sense of what actually the city does. It's about the sea, it's about the connection to the mountains, it's about the belief in the urban block. I mean, the fact that Cerdà invented the word urbanism, I guess, gives you a rather privileged position in terms of that debate, which has a lot of, I guess, spin-offs in terms of social and business aspects, which normally are not seen that way. You know, vision, that's just for the architects, for the planners. You know, what's that going? You try that in Rio in 2 weeks' time, Tony. They're not interested in vision. They're just saying, you know, our problems are far too severe. So when you say that you would prefer to live in the favela on the left-hand side rather than the right-hand side, this week you may have heard in the press, 15 new favelas in Rio have been pacified. Now the word pacified, which in Spanish you know, pacificación, I guess, it actually means helicopters, armored cars, machine guns and everything else taking over places which were no-go areas for maybe 20, 30 years. And I've been to a couple in the last weeks. And of course pacification brings also numbness. They become too sanitized. Now I'm not arguing for crime, for drugs trade and arms trade for small kids. But actually having a city, which is I think what you were getting at, is edgy. You know, Raval is edgy, it was edgy. When Beth and Oriol went to live in Plaza Real, Jesus, can't have been easy to walk home at night in the dark or in the daytime, you know. And this edginess and ability to reinvent yourself all the time is, I think, interesting, which raises a big issue for all of us, which is the issue of when business comes in and the middle classes take over, is gentrification bad? You know, big debate, and also here, when you bring a lot of foreigners into the city, the middle classes take over and pacify areas, is that bad? And big debate around the London Olympics for obvious reasons, once you've created this. Well, if you manage that properly, it also means that those fringe people, the artists, the other entrepreneurs, move, and they colonize sort of other areas. And that's why I said before that the issue of resilience, which I know Tony's very interested in here, how do you actually protect the city from being over-visioned, I think is also another important aspect. How do you allow it to react to shocks, you know, in such a way that you haven't worked everything out? And I think that's just another model, another issue that I think is part of the discussion, but very much picked up by the three of you, so to speak, coming from different angles.
Maria?
Bé, jo aquí, tots parlem de Barcelona com un model de ciutat des del punt de vista arquitectònic. I jo he afegit el tema de convivència, no? Que és molt important. Però jo crec que avui el repte que té Barcelona no és només l'arquitectònic, que el dominem, o el social, que tenim un model, estem entrenats amb aquest model, sinó el repte que té és ser una ciutat global, una ciutat que tingui influència global. I perquè una ciutat tingui influència global ha de ser possible que sigui aquesta ciutat impulsora i catalitzadora de la nova economia. Una ciutat que no sigui capaç de generar una economia d'interès global és una ciutat que no té futur. O és una ciutat que es anirà empobrint a poc a poc. Llavors, jo penso que avui el repte de Barcelona no és l'arquitectura. Finalment, l'urbanisme i l'arquitectura és un tema molt important, però és un dels temes, no és el tema. I jo, des de Barcelona Global, aquesta reflexió que l'estem fent ara i que volem i que us invitem a fer-la junts, és de que com podem fer que Barcelona sigui una de les ciutats, de les 10 ciutats més influents del món. Llavors, jo soc andorrana, que ell no ho sap, que encara és pitjor, més petit, no? Doncs, però Barcelona té totes les condicions i té uns sectors diversificats i una gent molt creativa i molt curiosa i molt ben connectada al món, però aquesta connexió que té les empreses i la gent a dins no funciona. O sigui, hi ha una massa atomització i l'esforç que té de fer avui un sector o una empresa a Barcelona per treure el cap a nivell global és massa gran. Llavors, per això jo he començat avui a parlar de la necessitat de catalitzar aquesta energia, d'empaquetar-la i de projectar-la al món. I és, crec, una de les reptes que té aquesta ciutat, que no és un tema urbanístic, és un tema d'influència econòmica.
A mi em sembla que aquest assumpte que porta la Maria a debat ja em sembla que és essencial i ara seré una mica parroquial, no? Des del punt de vista dels interessos econòmics. Jo sí crec que l'activitat econòmica, el lideratge en l'activitat econòmica, i naturalment no pot ser amb totes, han de ser amb algunes i s'han de seleccionar quines, atrau riquesa, atrau talent, fa que les ciutats hi hagi més mestissatge, vull dir, creixin amb riquesa cultural o creixin amb riquesa econòmica. A mi em sembla que això és absolutament fonamental. Bé, a mi m'agradaria fer una proposta molt poc meditada, però per tant fresca, no? En el sentit de dir, si efectivament a Barcelona pensem que hi ha sectors, i tots més o menys sabem quins són, no? En els quals podem ser líders en el món, no? Un podria ser la biotecnologia, l'altre podrien ser les comunicacions, l'altre podria ser la moda, l'altre podria ser tot el relacionat amb l'alimentació. Jo crec que una qüestió que es podria fer segurament des d'un àmbit públic i privat és identificar aquests sectors, que no ha de ser un número tancat, però preguntant als líders d'aquests sectors què necessiten perquè l'entorn i la base organitzativa de la ciutat permeti que això creixi. Tenen dificultats per muntar els seus negocis, és un problema de transport, és un problema de preu del sol, és un problema de comunicació, és un problema de... Tenim l'aeroport que necessitem, tenim les comunicacions que necessitem, tenim el talent que necessitem, tenim les universitats on surten i tots aquells professionals que després aniran a treballar en aquells sectors. Què és el que ens falta? A mi em sembla que aquesta reflexió fora bona fer-la per poder donar resposta en aquests sectors que en el fons són els que els sectors faran que Barcelona sigui una ciutat líder en el sentit que la Maria s'expressava.
Molt bé, portem gairebé 2 hores parlant. Voldria oferir al públic poder expressar les seves opinions o comentaris del conferenciant o de les persones que han participat en aquest debat. Veig 3 paraules, començarem aquí darrere. Us demano, sisplau, 5 paraules. Voldria demanar si voleu fer un comentari o una pregunta molt curta, molt concreta.
Sí, hola, bona tarda, el meu nom és Oriol Molas. Aviam, el model que ens has presentat, Richard, jo crec que també és bastant producte de la latitud on està Londres, no? Que és un territori on realment no gaudeix d'una alternativa gaire més que la campinya anglesa. Però, vull dir, Barcelona, per exemple, que té una altra latitud molt més propera a l'Equador, i té també un benefici, que és quan la península ibèrica es va deixar Àfrica i va connectar-se amb el continent europeu, va provocar un altre fet diferencial, que és l'existència dels Pirineus, amb una gran aportació. I fent un símil amb els Jocs Olímpics, realment la bondat de que Madrid no hagués agafat el 2020, no li hagués tocat el 2020, obre la porta a que Barcelona completi la seva oferta amb els Jocs d'hivern, que espero que ens posem a treballar aviat. Aleshores, aquest és, podríem dir, el repte que les ciutats, que realment no són més que un ecosistema d'espais que reuneixen un conjunt d'espais adaptats a unes activitats que es comuniquen per canals i s'interrelacionen per fluxes, és això el que realment ha de fer mantindre aquesta ciutat. I aleshores amb els Jocs Olímpics, que realment la història de Barcelona és una història que s'ha anat muntant a través d'esdeveniments, pot donar una gran transformació i un nou model d'entendre el territori, de passar de la ciutat compacta al territori compacte. És aquesta l'aposta del segle XXI.
Molt bé, moltes gràcies. Tenim una paraula demanada.
Hola, bona tarda. L'exposició del professor ha estat molt convincent en com el medi urbà, com es pot organitzar molt millor i de manera molt més òptima el medi urbà per estructurar les activitats. No obstant, crec que és una visió parcial, perquè les ciutats tenen un impacte geogràfic descomunal. Poso dos exemples molt senzillets. A Hong Kong, que segurament és la ciutat més eficient com a medi, com a lloc construït, o Tòquio, que té una gran eficiència segurament. Una activitat tan tonta com el menjar sushi, el Tòquio, segurament és el major devastador de bancs de tonyina del món. De fet, ho sabem. O, per exemple, com el consum de palets està deforestant extensions i quilòmetres quadrats i milers de quilòmetres quadrats a Xina, no? Inclús provocant problemes polítics entre els dos països. Què vull dir? Perquè valdria la pena insertar perquè segurament considerem el medi urbà però el que està urbanitzat, però no el que és el fenomen metropolità o la metropolització de les activitats, que queden molt poques àrees en el món segurament que escapen a això. I això, tornant a veure el diagrama aquell de desenvolupament, benestar i sostenibilitat ecològica, curiosament, els països rics són els que són insostenibles. N'hi ha més o menys sostenibles, als Estats Units ho és el pitjor, segurament hi ha països que s'organitzen millor, són menys insostenibles, però segurament es tracta també d'una qüestió de riquesa o no riquesa, és una dialèctica molt difícil. A mi si em donen a escollir, entre una favela i aquell edifici, jo no sé, però la favela, si volem ser sostenibles, actualment com ens gestionem és o vivim en condicions de favela amb el nivell de confort que implica, jo crec que ningú voldrà viure en les condicions de confort que tenen les faveles, o ens plantegem que això és molt difícil, jo crec que molt poca gent ho fa, és com generem benestar i l'activitat i l'economia i la riquesa amb benestar baixant d'aquesta corba crítica de la terra que vostè dibuixava que estava molt bé, perquè segurament els sostenibles són les faveles i no sé, aquí és molt més complicat.
Molt bé, moltes gràcies.
Sí, moltes gràcies al professor Ricky Burdett per la seva explicació, ha estat excel·lent. 4 reflexions molt curtes. La primera, vàrem organitzar un viatge a Londres pel pont de la Mercè, aquest col·legi d'arquitectes, i visitant els despatxos del Foster i del Rogers ens comentaven que cada dia 2 milions de persones a la City, el 90% ho fan en transport públic i el 10% restant, un 5% en bicicleta i un 5% en cotxe privat. Això és, quan fan aquells edificis, aquells gratacels que coneixem de l'Skyline de Londres, no hi ha aparcaments, hi ha molt pocs aparcaments. Què hi ha al darrere això? Hi ha uns valors, el Hobart segur, la Garden City i una colla de valors que han marcat una política de defensa del transport públic i això es nota en la configuració de la ciutat. Aquí tenim uns valors que durant la dictadura van venir dels Estats Units i suposo que hi té molt a veure Robert Moses, l'Sproul, l'Standard Oil i la General Motors que van generar, diguem-ne, l'Sproul que hem patit nosaltres i una dependència absoluta del transport privat. Aquests valors val la pena tenir-los en compte. La segona reflexió és que a Catalunya tenim 947 municipis, 700 dels quals són menors de 5.000 habitants. I Barcelona no té una estructura metropolitana com altres ciutats que tu has explicat. I aquest dèficit de la manca d'estructura metropolitana que es va desfer semblantment quan la Margaret Thatcher va desfer el Great London, jo penso que és un dels reptes importantíssims que s'haurien de resoldre per l'Ajuntament de Barcelona i pel Govern de Catalunya d'una manera immediata. La tercera reflexió, m'ha agradat molt que anomenessis els 3 elements de Crow, Harlem, Brundtland, del desenvolupament econòmic, el desenvolupament mediambiental i el desenvolupament social. Jo la paraula que he sentit més de la teva explicació ha estat els aspectes socials, i m'agrada això, no eren pas els negocis per mi, sinó que has esmentat constantment els problemes socials i penso que és importantíssim tenir en compte aquests elements a l'hora d'analitzar aquestes ciutats d'arreu del món. I la quarta reflexió i última és que el model Barcelona es basa en una estratègia de l'Ajuntament de Barcelona i amb una participació de l'empresa privada, però a partir d'una estratègia que comanda l'administració. I el segon aspecte és el que explicava i explica molt bé l'Oriol Molas. Jo no crec en un urbanisme abstracte de coeficients, sinó que crec en el projecte urbà. El projecte urbà dona forma a la ciutat i penso que aquests elements són interessants, com també els que planteja Jaime Lerner a Curitiba, d'aprofitar els recursos propis. Quan va caure el mur de Berlín l'any 1989, l'any 1990 i 91 vam anar a Berlín i el responsable de l'Ajuntament de Berlín ens deia, és que no dono l'abast perquè la pressió és brutal de moltíssimes empreses que volen venir a instal·lar-se aquí. Per tant, les presses del mercat hi són, però jo penso que l'estratègia de tenir un marc des de l'Ajuntament per mi és bàsic pel model de Barcelona i per moltes altres experiències que tu has explicat.
Molt bé, moltes gràcies. Tenim dues paraules més, només si terminarem, perquè... No necessito. Per la traducció.
Jo només tinc una pregunta i un comentari. La pregunta és, is gentrification positive or negative?
Contestarà al final.
I l'altre és que un dels llocs on hi ha més creativitat del món, en aquest moment, potser no és un nucli urbà dens. Jo he viscut molts anys a Califòrnia i conec Silicon Valley molt bé, i tot allò són poblets petits, Palo Alto, Mountain View, etc. I allà hi ha tot l'embrió del que està passant al món avui i del que potser passarà demà. I un comentari també a la senyora Reig, que estic molt d'acord amb ella, és amb treure la qualitat. I aquí hi ha un exemple, aquí a 30 quilòmetres d'aquí, que potser no hi ha ningú que sàpiga de què parlaré quan els hi mencioni. És l'Institut de Ciències Fotòniques de Castelldefels. Vaig anar a visitar-lo la setmana passada. Aquí a Barcelona ningú sap què és això. I aquest institut, en aquest moment, pel Max Planck de Múnich, està considerat el millor institut de Photonic Research del món. I ningú en sap res. Així es té de fer soroll que valgui la pena. No el soroll que t'avala de vere rebus tumultum.
Molt bé. La penúltima intervenció.
Bé, gràcies per la jornada. Una pregunta pel senyor Burdett. Si parlem de Global Cities, la Maria Reig ha introduït un terme que jo crec que és important posar damunt la taula, que és la nova economia. I ho dic perquè als anys 90, quan va començar a despegar tot el boom de les TIC, d'internet, de l'economia del coneixement, de l'economia de la informació, com li vulguem dir, i qui es va atrevir a aventurar que això era un declivi per les ciutats perquè es podria treballar, es podria fer teletreball, es podria treballar des de molts llocs diferents. Això evidentment no ha estat així, sinó al contrari. Aquesta economia necessita de les ciutats i en Ricky Burdett i venint del London Economics, la pregunta és quina relació creu que hi ha entre aquesta nova economia i la ciutat com a espai físic, com a espai necessari perquè aquesta economia virtual toqui de peus a terra.
Molt bé, l'últim comentari de la Mercè.
Maria, m'ha agradat molt la teva intervenció. El teu repte és el nostre repte. Estem al Col·legi d'Arquitectes i quan tu dius que el repte que tenim ara és el repte de la globalitat, que aquest repte els arquitectes és el que estem vivint ara. M'ha sorprès, no obstant, que has dit que és un repte econòmic exclusivament. I jo diria que hi ha molts arquitectes que estan en aquesta xarxa internacional en aquest moment, treballant, no diré noms, i crec que no és exclusivament econòmic, que hi ha aquesta influència de l'arquitectura internacional en el món acadèmic i en aquest sentit voldria donar pes en el lloc on estem, que és la casa dels arquitectes, i que tots plegats és el repte que estem compartint, no només econòmic, sinó també conceptual i cultural.
Molt bé, Ricky, maybe you can reply and we close the session.
Well, it's always wonderful and enriching to hear questions, brackets, statements from my Latin friends, I'm so used to the Anglo-Saxon, very narrow 2-second question, as opposed to this broad reflection on what all of you in very different ways are reacting to from what the panel has said, and I certainly am not going to try and respond to, because I think actually the way you've come back from the ecosystem to the sushi and the tuna fish problem, to IT, to Palo Alto, in many ways gives you the multidimensionality of the problem and the opportunity of the city. So the mere fact that actually you're in this building and talking about it in this way is great news. So I think that's actually very, very important. If I were at the Architectural Association or the Royal Institute of British Architects, I would say it's very unlikely that you would have this wider debate. So congratulations for doing that. I think just a couple of reflections. I think the tuna fish issue is not one I had considered. If you want to attack the food chain issue, I would go for McDonald's and burgers. In the sense, poor Japanese who are, so careful about what they do with the environment. It's interesting that you pick them up. But of course you're right, both questions are about the other side. We could have had this conversation nearly on the same grounds and just talked about cities as metabolisms. In fact, that's something that Tony and I have recently discussed it. Whether the metabolism is about the IT infrastructure and how it makes actually space more efficient, more effective, better at talking to you. One example on that. Basically the story that IT would make us all leave cities has just never happened, anywhere. In New York, Bryant Park was this space, very dangerous space behind New York Public Library for years, right in the middle of rich New York. People, by introducing effectively wireless for free there, it's turned, together with investment in nice planting and seating and everything else, it's turned it into a place where a certain group of people would never ever meet in public now meet. So I'm using that as a tiny microcosm how retrofitting actually public space with good IT actually helps. There are a number of major public institutions in London, as there are here, where you just go to the South Bank Centre on the River Thames because it's a beautiful 1960s building and you get free wireless. What more do you want? It's a sort of teenager's dream in many ways. So I think that's the fact that values are at the heart of everything we're talking about, I think is given by the three comments made. If I had come and had this discussion in London First, which is your equivalent organization in Britain, in London, sorry, it would have been much more about, okay, how are we going to get a Japanese company to invest here, right? While your sense is much more about recognizing the core values that the city has, part of which is spatial, but it's not separate from the culture. It's so endemic, and I think that is important. The quick answer to your question, gentrification is good. And it's a very controversial thing to say, as long as you manage that process through politics. So if you provide a policy for affordable housing for any new development. I don't know what it is here, but you have one. Ken Livingston, the mayor Richard Rogers and I worked for, had a regulation is important, that every housing development with more than 10 units, 50% has to be affordable. Most Americans think this is Stalinist intervention. The developers love this. It's certainty. They know. Are you going to give me more? Are you going to give me less? I've got it built 10 feet, fine. This mayor has brought it down. It's very interesting. It varies in different parts of the city, rightly, and I agree with Boris Johnson on this, because if you're in a borough, in a part of London which has 70-80% affordable housing, why do you need more? What you actually need is some rich people who are going to spend money there. So there the affordable housing quotient is actually reduced. Across London it's 35%, which is still a lot. So I think gentrification, you have to have people move and invest, particularly wealthier in migrants, which is what I think actually Barcelona and London are relatively similar, even though you have a different profile and different geography of immigrants. But I think all these things really do tie up together, that you can't separate the discussion about space, planning, social impacts and the competitiveness of the city, which is all about actually one thing. The only cities in the world which are competitive, which work, is where young people want to go. Only. The minute you start getting a population which is, middle-age spread and up, and I speak with great authority on the subject of middle-age spread, become dead, and if you can't attract younger people, and this is what you did here admirably in the last 20, 30 years, and Genova, Rome, I can go on. Even Berlin, I have to say, with one recent exception, have been a disaster at doing that. And the last point about whoever was complaining about how many mayors you have in Catalonia, just think of the French. The Ile-de-France has 1,126 mayors, and they're French.
Okay, thank you, Ricky. Thank you, Barcelona Global. Thank you, the Order of Architects of Catalonia. Good night.
Grazie.
Porque esto es la reflexión que yo hice como presidenta de la comisión.
Sí.
Y está en catalán, pero tú
No,
puedes,
lo entiendo.
¿entiendes? Y ya verás que es muy fácil de leer, hay negritos, hay resaltados, y te va a encantar.
Thank you. We'll talk more at dinner.
Has estat molt brillant. M'ha agradat moltíssim.